Today on Unworthy History, we'll be reading some actual history from the following book. History of Texas, 1685 to 1846, by Henderson K. Yoakum. This book was published all the way back in 1855. So in today's episode, we are going to read some Republic of Texas history from 1841. We'll hear about some skirmishes with Mexican outlaws along the border, and then we'll read about the ill-fated Santa Fe expedition. This was where a large body of soldiers, political envoys, and merchants traveled to New Mexico in an attempt to establish Texas jurisdiction over the Santa Fe region. The freebooters on the Texas frontier found time to make occasional excursions across the Rio Grande. Sometimes they would capture the property of citizens, and even the citizens themselves. Captain Philip Dimmitt, long distinguished as a pioneer and gallant defender of Texas, became their victim. He was engaged with some workmen on the 4th of July, 1841, in erecting a mercantile establishment on Corpus Christi Bay, about 15 miles below the present town of Corpus Christi, when the place was visited by Captain Sanchez, aide-de-camp to General Ampudia, with a party of 15 cavalry who took Dimmitt and his men prisoners, and after plundering the establishment, conducted them to Matamoros. From this point, they, with others, were taken to Monterey and delivered over to Arista. By his order, they were ironed and started into the interior, under a guard commanded by Captain Chafind. That officer, a humane man, had their irons taken off the first day's march. On the third day, they arrived at Saltillo. Here their anticipations of a long imprisonment and horrid treatment were such that they resolved to attempt their escape. They proposed to procure a quantity of mescal drugged with morphine and to give it to the guards, and while they were affected by it, to escape. 2 physicians who were among the prisoners were charged with this duty. Their gourds being supplied with this mixture, they arrived at the Hacienda de Aguaya Nueva, where they were quartered for the night. The Mexican guards abundantly helped themselves to the liquor in the gourds, and in the night the signal was given to make the attack. By some means, however, the morphine proved to be inefficient, and the mescal alone had served to keep the guards awake and to stimulate their courage. There were only 19 of the Texans armed with but a few guns which they had picked up, and a guard of 10 times their number. The Texans had got off some distance when daylight appearing, Captain Chafind sent for them, and said that if they would return they should be forgiven. If not, he would have Dimmitt shot. This was repeated in hearing of the latter, who, fearing that Chafind would put his threat into execution, and not wishing to be shot like a felon, took a large dose of morphine which he had with him. Having taken the opiate, he wrote a letter to his wife, made a disposition of his property, and then calmly lay down on his blankets, requesting his friends around him to make known his death, and solicit the Texans to throw the mantle of charity over the act. "I do not fear death," said he, "but dread the idea of ending my life in a loathsome dungeon. Tell them I prefer a Roman's death to the ignominy of perpetual imprisonment, and that my last wish is for my country's welfare." Soon after he sunk into a sleep from which he never awoke. Thus fell a noble spirit by whom the first Lone Star banner was unfurled on the heights of La Bahia. One of these bands of Mexicans, under Ignacio Garcia, was met on the 7th of April about 10 miles from Laredo by Captain John C. Hayes, in command of a company of 25 spies. After a short contest, the enemy retreated, leaving 3 killed and 3 wounded. Hayes pursued the fugitives so closely that he took 25 of them prisoners, without the loss of any in his command. These scouts under Captain Hayes were very useful and efficient in protecting the western frontier from both Mexican and Indian incursions. In the latter part of the spring of 1841, extensive preparations were being made in Texas for an armed visit to Santa Fe. The Congress having failed to make an appropriation for the army, it was disbanded, and consequently there were many men thrown out of employment who were anxious for such an adventure. The objects and motives of the expedition must be explained. It has already been stated that the Secretary of War had warmly recommended it in his report. President Lamar had spoken on the subject in the message of 1839. The friends of the measure had brought it up in each house of Congress by the introduction of bills authorizing authorizing an expedition to Santa Fe, providing only for a small outfit, but both bills were rejected. The object of the expedition was to endeavor to prevail upon the people of New Mexico, residing within the statutory limits of Texas, to submit quietly and peaceably to an incorporation with the other citizens of the Republic, and to acknowledge the right of Texas to complete jurisdiction over them. This being done, the revenue laws were to be put into operation, and a small military force retained there for the purpose of repelling any sudden attack of Mexicans or Indians. A commissioner was also to reside at Santa Fe, as the agent of the government, with special instructions for his guidance. No further alterations were to be made in the laws or the form of government of the people than were absolutely necessary in the change of their allegiance. It was stated in an official paper that the expedition had been solicited by some of the citizens of Santa Fe, and that the commander was instructed by President Lamar not to attempt a subjugation of the people by arms, should it be found that they were unwilling to submit to the Texan laws, and that the men were only permitted to go as an armed body to defend themselves and the articles of traffic taken with them against the hordes of Indians which they might encounter on the way. The members of the expedition rendezvoused at an encampment on Brushy Creek, about 20 miles from Austin. The military, under the command of Brevet Brigadier General Hugh McLeod, consisted of 5 companies of mounted infantry and 1 of artillery. Accompanying these went a caravan of merchants with goods suited to the market, drawn in wagons, and some adventurers who were neither soldiers nor merchants, but who went along for pleasure, and finally messengers William G. Cook, R.F. Brennan, and J.A. Navarro, the commissioners who were charged by the president with the execution of his instructions. Difficulties were raised in fitting out the expedition. There was no law making any appropriation for such an object, and each branch of the Congress had rejected a proposition for such an appropriation. The President, however, gave orders to the quartermaster and commissary generals of the militia to contract for the necessary provisions and munitions of war for the expedition. Having endorsed the orders himself, he directed the proper officers to audit and pay them. The controller, having refused to allow these accounts, was ordered to do so by the President, through the Secretary of the Treasury. The Gordian knot being thus untied, the expedition set out from Brushy Creek on the 20th of June, 1841. The President had spent the previous night in the camp, and after taking leave of the pioneers, he returned to the capital. This expedition was unfortunate in wanting the sanction of law and in its consequences, and especially in the time of its departure. For on the 22nd of June, the commissioner sent by Arista to treat of an armistice arrived in Austin. A more favorable feeling was beginning to appear. A brisk trade was springing up between Texas and the Rio Grande, encouraged by both parties, and it was understood that Arista was willing to unite with the Texan authorities in the overthrow of the robbers that infested the plains of that river. As soon, however, as the commissioners learned of the departure of the Santa Fe expedition, they returned to Mexico, and the abduction of Captain Dimmitt and others followed. The number of volunteers doing duty under the orders of General McLeod was around 270, the remainder of those connected with the expedition consisting of the staff, the commissioners, merchants, tourists, and servants, numbered about 50. The long train of wagons moving heavily forward with the different companies of volunteers, all well mounted and well armed, and riding in double file, presented an imposing as well as an animating spectacle, causing every heart to beat high with the anticipation of exciting incidents on the boundless prairies. After innumerable adventures such as buffalo hunts, Indian skirmishes, and Mustang chases, and much privation, with a loss of some few of the party, they arrived on the 11th of August within 70 or 80 miles, as they supposed, of San Miguel. During most of this time they had been lost among the mountains of the Red and Wachita rivers. From this point they sent forward messengers Howland, Baker, and Rosenberry to procure provisions and ascertain how the expedition would be received. The main body continued their wandering journey through a broken, barren country until the 10th of September, when they came to something like an old cart road, but it was soon lost in the sandy waste. The party were nearly driven to desperation by hunger. Every tortoise and snake, every living and creeping thing was seized upon and swallowed by the famishing men, with a rapacity that nothing but the direst hunger could induce. A few days afterward, they came up with some Mexicans on their return from a trading excursion among the Indians, but the latter could give them nothing to eat nor any information except that San Miguel was still some 70 or 80 miles distant, but that there were settlements and flocks of sheep where they could procure food, at the village of Anton Chico. The advance, which had first encountered the Mexicans, sent back 3 of them to guide the main body by a shorter route, while they set out for the settlements. Arriving at a fine camping ground on the Rio Galinas where the shepherds kept their flocks, a scene of feasting ensued which beggars description. The next morning it was determined by the advance party to send W.P. Lewis, captain of the artillery, and George Van Ness, secretary of the commissioners, directly to San Miguel. Messengers Howard, Fitzgerald, and Kendall accompanied them. They took a letter to the alcalde informing him that a large trading party from Texas was approaching, and that their views were in every way pacific, and that they desired to purchase a considerable quantity of provisions and send it back to the main body. They also took with them a copy of President Lamar's proclamation, stating the object of the expedition, and that if the inhabitants of New Mexico were not disposed peaceably to join the Texas standard, the expedition would forthwith return. Accordingly, Captain Lewis and his party left the Rio Galinas on the 14th of September for San Miguel. The shepherds at the Galinas had informed the advance that the country was in arms against the Texans, and that Howland and his companions who had been sent in advance on the 11th of August were now prisoners at Santa Fe. Here, it would seem, a courier should have been dispatched to General McLeod with the information, so that, whether true or false, he could have been on his guard. Howland was in fact in prison, and attempted to make his escape to give notice to the Texan commander, but he was retaken, and for that offense afterward he was shot in San Miguel. Captain Lewis and his party, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 14th of September, came up with 2 muleteers. From them they learned that Howland's party were prisoners at Santa Fe, and that a great stir and excitement existed in the country in consequence of Governor Armijo having informed the people that it was the intentions of the Texans to burn, slay, and destroy as they went. Here again, it seems that this information should have been conveyed back to the main body. It was transmitted to the party left at Rio Galinas, but not to McLeod. That night, Lewis and his companions slept at Anton Chico, where they received an intimation that they would be arrested and shot the next day. Disregarding this warning, they proceeded towards San Miguel, but on the way they were surrounded, disarmed, and dismounted, in the politest manner possible, by a company of the Mexicans under the command of Don Salazar, and started on foot for the point of their destination. Shortly afterward they set out on the march for Santa Fe, but on the road they met Governor Armijo, on his way to attack the Texan invaders of New Mexico. In addition to the fatigue of the march, the captives were tied together, and in this condition about sunset they met Armijo. The governor saluted them as friends, stated that he had heard of their capture, and asked them who they were. Captain Lewis replied that they were merchants from the United States. Here Van Ness interrupted him and said that with the exception of Kendall, they were all Texans. Armijo, seeing the Lone Star and the word Texas on Lewis's coat, took him by the collar and said, "What does this mean? I can read. Texas." "You need not think to deceive me," continued the governor. "No merchant from the United States ever travels with a Texan military jacket." Lewis, being well versed in Spanish, was taken as the governor's interpreter and mounted on a mule. His companions were compelled to retrace their steps on foot towards San Miguel, where they arrived on the following morning and saw Howland and Baker, 2 of the Texans, shot. Armijo next proceeded against Colonel Cook, who was left at the Rio Galinas with the advance of the expedition, consisting of 94 men. The day after Lewis and his party had left Colonel Cook, the latter set out with his force and encamped near Anton Chico. He sent 4 of his men to the village to buy provisions, where they were arrested but afterward released. Cook asked Salazar what had become of Lewis and his party. He answered that being satisfied with their good intentions, he had sent them on to the governor. On the 17th of September, when Cook was about to set out for Santa Fe, Salazar sent him word that Armijo would be there in a few hours. With professions of great friendship on the part of Salazar, Cook soon found himself pretty well surrounded by 400 or 500 men. He was about to commence an engagement when someone said that Captain Lewis was at the head of the Mexican forces. Very soon, Lewis in company with the governor's nephew advanced. The former told Cook that the people of New Mexico were exasperated against the Texans and were in arms, that in addition to the 600 troops before them, he had seen 4,000 more well equipped who would be on the ground within a few hours, and that there were 5,000 more on the march from Chihuahua. But Governor Armijo had commissioned him to say that if the Texans would give up their arms, they could have permission to come in and trade, and that at the end of 8 days they would be returned to them. Lewis further stated that such was the custom of the St. Louis traders when they came to Santa Fe, and no harm could result from such a course, and for the truth of these statements he pledged his honor. The Texans believed Lewis, gave up their arms, then they were betrayed, arrested, and plundered. William P. Lewis was a traitor. One is here reminded of the promises made to Fannin before his surrender. The following day, Governor Armijo arrived and ordered the prisoners to be all tied and started them on to Mexico, without permitting them to see their friends who had been previously taken, after which he immediately set out to meet the main body of the Texans under General McLeod. The latter, after receiving the message sent by the Mexicans at the Rio Galinas, proceeded on his march, but the constant annoyance of the Indians and above all starvation rendered his movements slow and wore out his command. He had reached the Laguna Colorado some 30 or 40 miles from the Rio Galinas when he was met by Armijo. Having but few men fit for service, their horses having nearly all perished or run away, and many of the men having thrown aside their arms to relieve themselves of the burden, the Texans, upon the promise of good treatment and that their personal effects should be returned to them, surrendered. This being done, they were searched, plundered, bound, and marched off to San Miguel, where the last of them arrived on the 12th of October. Kendall assigns the following as causes of the failure of the expedition. In the first place, the expedition began its march too late in the season by at least 6 weeks. Had it left Austin on the 1st of May, the grass would have been much better, and we should have had little difficulty in finding good water for both ourselves and our cattle. In the second place, we were disappointed in obtaining a party of Lipan Indians as guides, and were consequently obliged to take a route some 300 miles out of the way, and in many places extremely difficult to travel. Thirdly, the government of Texas did not furnish wagons and oxen enough to transport the goods of the merchants, and this, as a matter of course, caused serious delays. Fourthly, cattle enough on the hoof were not provided, even with the second supply sent for by the commissioners from Little River. Again, the distance was vastly greater than we had anticipated in our widest and wildest calculations, owing to which circumstance and an improvident waste of provisions while on the buffalo range, we found ourselves upon half allowance in the very middle of our long journey, a privation which weakened, dispirited, and rendered the men unfit for duty. The Indians also annoyed us much by their harassing and continual attempts to cut off our small parties and steal our horses. Finally, the character of the governor of New Mexico was far from being understood, and his power was underrated by all. General Lamar's estimate of the views and feelings of the people of Santa Fe and the vicinity was perfectly correct. Not a doubt can exist that they all were and are anxious to throw off the oppressive yoke of Armijo and come under the liberal institutions of Texas. But the governor found us divided into small parties, broken down by long marches and want of food, discovered too a traitor among us, and taking advantage of these circumstances, his course was plain, and his conquest easy. It would seem that when the advance reached the Galinas and had an intimation of a hostile feeling, they should have notified General McLeod of that fact, and as the sheepfolds furnish an abundance of meat, they should have sent back a supply to his famishing soldiers, and above all remained there till he came up and recruited his men. At all events, they were paraded in bonds on the Plaza of San Miguel on the morning of the 17th of October and marched to Mexico by way of Santa Fe. Armijo, the governor, is fully described by Kendall, and he seems to have obtained in New Mexico a very consistent account of him. He began his career about Albuquerque, the place of his nativity, by sheep stealing. At this business he was very expert. Even after he became governor, he boasted of having stolen and sold to the owner thereof the same ewe 14 times. As he grew up, he turned his attention to Monte, at which he was very successful. He took the lead in the revolt against centralism in 1837, but secretly remained at his hacienda. Upon the overthrow of the Federal Party in Santa Fe, he managed to get himself appointed governor. In that exalted station he was controlled by no law but his own will, nor did his desires extend beyond the accumulation of wealth. His character was as bad as it could be, and his actions were consistent with it. Previous to leaving San Miguel, the goods of the Texan merchants were brought to the square and disposed of according to the wishes of Governor Armijo. Captain William P. Lewis obtained a good share of them, as did also the governor. The prisoners were placed under the control and charge of Salazar, a brute in feeling, and a precious scoundrel in his business relations. To illustrate the conduct of Salazar, early on the second morning after leaving San Miguel, the prisoners, weary and chilled with cold, were ordered to rise and continue the march. The only food offered to 187 half-starved men consisted of 50 small cakes. Calling the prisoners around him, Salazar would toss a cake into the air to enjoy the scramble made by the poor fellows for the little morsel. Without giving a detail of a march so long and painful and under treatment so cruel, it is enough to say that in the first days of February 1842, the Texan captives being separated were safely confined in the prisons of Santiago, Puebla, and Perote. Back in Texas, on the 18th day of January 1842, the first authentic information of the capture of the Santa Fe expedition was received in the Texan capital. It came through Senor Alvarez, the American consul at Santa Fe, and with a wonderful accuracy of detail, it filled the people of the Republic with profound sorrow. They had seen a well-appointed force of noble spirits set out from the Valley of the Brushy on the 21st of June, proceeding as they supposed to an easy and peaceful conquest. During the long march through the wilderness they heard nothing from them, and it was indeed astounding to learn for the first time 7 months afterward that the entire expedition, with all the arms, horses, and goods, had been taken, without the firing of a gun. The property appropriated by the captors, and the prisoners bound and on the march to the city of Mexico. On the receipt of the first report of the capture, the Texan representative at Washington laid the matter before the government of the United States and urged its kind offices in behalf of the prisoners. As many of them were citizens of that republic and had gone out in no hostile attitude but only as travelers and adventurers, the fact was also strongly urged. Mr. Secretary Webster immediately sent special instructions to Mr. Ellis, the American minister at Mexico, to procure the release of the citizens of the United States so captured, and in relation to the Texan prisoners, he charged them to say to the Mexican authorities that summary, sanguinary, or undue punishment of the Texans in their custody would be more apt to defeat the object of that punishment than if the offenders were to have a fair trial, that it would excite and foment in the United States a bitterness of feeling prejudicial to Mexico. Therefore, in a friendly manner, regular judicial proceedings and mild punishments were recommended. Texas, not satisfied with this step, urged the appointment of a special envoy from the United States to Mexico, and as the captives had many friends about Washington, a memorial was strongly signed and presented for that purpose. Other memorials also came in from a distance. These were followed by resolutions from the legislature of Kentucky, and then by resolutions of inquiry from the National House of Representatives. Mr. Armory, the Texan charge d'affaires, called upon Senator Preston of South Carolina for advice. Mr. Preston suggested that General Waddy Thompson of his own state be sent as minister to Mexico, with full instructions on the subject, and immediately waited on Mr. Webster and urged his appointment. The latter approved of the proposition and promised to lay it before President Tyler. General Thompson was appointed, and took out with further instructions to demand positively the release of the prisoners who were citizens of the United States, and also requiring that the Texans who were in captivity should be treated with humanity, and not abused or put to slavish or degrading labor. The Texan Congress, upon receipt of the intelligence of the capture of the party sent to Santa Fe, passed an act extending the boundaries of the Republic, so as to include portions of the state of Tamaulipas, Coahuila, Durango, and Sinaloa, and the whole of Chihuahua, Sonora, New Mexico, and the two Californias, embracing a country of greater extent than the American Union at that time, and including 2/3 of the territory of Mexico, with 2 millions of her inhabitants. President Houston vetoed the bill upon several grounds. He stated that other nations would view it as a legislative jest, inasmuch as it was the assumption of a right utterly impossible to exercise. He took occasion also in his veto message to give a view of his Pacific policy. "I need not assure your honorable body," he observes, "of the ardent desire I entertain for peace and friendly intercourse with all nations. So long as we are not on amicable terms with Mexico, so long will we suffer hindrance to our prosperity. The constant cry of invasion will be sounded not only throughout Texas, but throughout all nations to whom we are known. And while this is the case, we may feel confident that immigration will be impeded, if not entirely prevented. From this source we are to draw both population and wealth. And no matter how desirable our soil and climate might be to foreigners, nor how great their anxiety to make our country their home, it certainly would be no additional inducement to families that Texas should remain in hostile relations with Mexico, which might and would at all times render their situation one of unpleasant excitement, if not danger. Texas only requires peace to make her truly prosperous and respectable. Peace will bring with it every advantage." He further argued that the bill for taking so much of their territory would arouse and unite the Mexicans, and excite them to a powerful effort against Texas, which would at least annoy the latter, and would draw her citizens from the pursuits of industry. He further stated that the mediation of Great Britain had been invoked, and its exercise only delayed to await the ratification of certain treaties, that should this extension of boundary, however, be enacted, it would form a barrier to any successful negotiation, and suspend all diplomatic action on the part of the British government. The President, in conclusion, stated that the moment selected for bringing forward such a measure was most unfortunate, as the Santa Fe prisoners were then in the hands of the enemy, and he was using his best efforts for their release. That the news of this claim set up by Texas to so much of Mexico, arriving in the capital of the latter country, would render abortive all its efforts for their liberation, and perhaps cause their destruction. The fact of the passage of the bill by Congress, notwithstanding the presidential veto, had an unhappy effect upon the diplomatic relations of Texas. Mr. Webster, the American Secretary of State, mentioned it to the Texan charge d'affaires, and said it looked as if Texas was too grasping, and might excite the jealousy of other nations. The unanimous vote of the people of Texas in 1837 in favor of annexation to the United States will be remembered, as also the diplomatic correspondence between Mr. Forsyth and Mr. Hunt on that subject. The administration of Martin Van Buren being opposed to it, the proposition was formally withdrawn by Texas on the 12th of October, 1838, and not revived again until 1842. On the 26th of January of that year, Mr. Riley, the Texan charge d'affaires at Washington, was instructed to direct his attention to the subject and observe whether there was any disposition on the part of the government of the United States to assent to or offer a proposal of that kind, and whether the American Congress and the people of that country manifested a like disposition. If so, he was directed to report the facts for further instructions. Mr. Riley, after making the necessary inquiries, reported to his government that the administration of President Tyler was decidedly in favor of the annexation policy, that it was popular with Congress, and that Texas was rapidly increasing in reputation and character in the United States. The position of President Tyler before the people of the American Union was peculiar. A reference to a few facts will illustrate this. In the contest between the two political parties in 1840, the Whigs advocated a United States Bank, and the Democrats the independent Treasury. William Henry Harrison, as the exponent of the Whig Party, was their candidate for president, and to enable them to succeed in the election, they had added to the ticket the name of John Tyler for vice president. The antecedents of the latter had shown him to be a Democrat and opposed to a national bank. Yet, as they would have the president on their side, the Whigs were willing to wink at these heresies of their vice president, provided they could thus draw over enough of the Democratic element to succeed. Mr. Tyler also waived the subject as much as possible in order to obtain the office. The plan was laid with great skill, advocated with unusual zeal, and crowned with triumphant success. On the 4th of March, 1841, these distinguished persons were duly installed into office, and an extra session of Congress called to meet on the last day of the following May to put the bank into operation. But on the 4th day of April, just 1 month after his installation, President Harrison died, and John Tyler was, by the Constitution, invested with the executive functions. The Congress met, and the triumphant party very soon chartered a bank, which, to satisfy the supposed scruples of President Tyler, they called the Fiscal Bank. He received the bill on the 6th of October and vetoed it on the 16th. As this veto was not included in the program of 1840, the Congress got up another bill, which, in further compliance with his conscientious scruples, was denominated the Fiscal Corporation. This bill was sent to him on the 3rd of September, and he returned it with his veto on the 9th. The Whig party, which had thus far sustained him, could stand it no longer, but nearly all deserted, with the exception of Daniel Webster, the Secretary of State, who had foresight enough to discover that a national bank was an obsolete idea. The entire cabinet of President Harrison resigned. Mr. Tyler, having estranged himself from his ancient friends, the Democrats, could not count on their aid, so the administration presented the anomaly of a government without friends. However, the president had patronage and some discretion, and soon gathered around him what was known in that day as a corporal's guard, and so the federal government went on. Since the Battle of San Jacinto, the annexation of Texas had been more or less discussed by the people and the press of the United States, and all men of discernment saw that it must take place, and that its consummation was only a question of time. The vast emigration to Texas following the achievement of her independence excited and hurried on this feeling in the popular mind. President Tyler saw it, and had too much penetration and was too much in need of friends to permit the performance of an act so glorious to pass into other hands. He spoke freely to the Texan minister on the subject. "I am anxious for it," said he, "and wish most sincerely I could conclude it at once." The president would act in a moment, wrote Mr. Riley, if the Senate would assent. But, as matters then stood, it was deemed best to mediate with Mexico. Accordingly, instructions were sent out to Waddy Thompson to use his best efforts to bring about a peace between Texas and Mexico. Now, this book, Yoakum's History of Texas, doesn't really tell us what happened to the prisoners of the Santa Fe expedition, but I'm going to read something published by the Texas Historical Commission that tells of their fate. The prisoners were marched 1,500 miles to Mexico City. Waiting for them was Santa Anna, anxious to exact revenge for his defeat at San Jacinto. Santa Anna was especially eager to punish Navarro, who he considered a traitor. After vigorous diplomatic efforts by the United States, Mexico finally agreed to release the Texans and send them home. Yet Santa Anna refused to free Navarro. He was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. But Santa Anna offered Navarro a deal. If he renounced Texas, he would be forgiven and allowed to take a prominent government position in Mexico. Navarro refused. He remained in prison for more than 3 years, never knowing what day he might be taken out and shot. Finally, with the help of sympathetic Mexicans, he escaped and returned to Texas. Navarro arrived home in midwinter of 1845. He was just days from turning 50 years old. He was considerably grayer and in failing health. Texans welcomed him as a great hero. He had proved his valor and courage as a prisoner of Santa Anna. Even under the threat of death, he remained a true Texas patriot, stating, "I have sworn to be a free Texan, and I shall never forswear." In 1846, the Texas legislature created Navarro County to honor his service. Navarro chose the name of the county seat as Corsicana. So that's it for this episode. We heard about the ill-fated Santa Fe expedition and the traitor William P. Lewis. Not much is known of this Lewis. It's possible he stayed in Mexico after turning against the Texans. Jose Antonio Navarro was condemned as a traitor by Santa Anna, but he was viewed as a true patriot by the Texans. So this episode will be part of a playlist I am doing on the Republic of Texas during this interesting time just prior to annexation. So in the next episode on this playlist, we will read about Colonel Snively's expedition of 1843. This was where the Texans would try to seek revenge on Armijo for his treatment of the men of the Santa Fe expedition. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.